Fractal Design has launched a series of cases called POP. We have 3 samples here. The range is absolutely enormous. Here's a thumbnail overview of POP. The Mini is micro ATX, and you can put a 240 cooler in the roof or the front with up to 8 storage drives. The POP is ATX. You can install a 240 cooler in the roof and a 240 or 280 in the front, again with up to 8 storage drives. The POP XL is eATX and can accommodate a 240 or 280 cooler in the roof, a 280 or 360 in the front, and up to 10 storage drives. Pricing looks very competitive. The cheapest model, £73 here in the UK, the most expensive, £97. In this video we're going to tackle the POP AIR RGB with cyan interior. The mid-tower ATX POP comes in a number of different versions. So in addition to the colour of the chassis, you also have to consider the colour of the interior. That doesn't apply to the larger XL or the smaller Mini. Then in addition to that, you could, if you choose, have a silent version of the case. So a solid top panel, solid front panel, and a choice there of glass on the side, which seems a bit peculiar to me, or solid side panel as well. When you go down to the micro ATX Mini, your options are reduced, but you still have a number. And if you go up to the large XL, the same is true. Part of the way that Fractal has kept the price remarkably low is that the accessories you get with this case are far fewer than you get with, say, a Define. So you get a bag of fasteners, a user guide which is up to their usual high standard, so that's a good thing, and you get some extended radiator brackets so you can offset a rad in the roof, whether it's a custom loop or AIO, to move it away from the memory slightly. However, if you want to, for example, have USB Type-C on your front I/O, which happens to be on the top, it's currently blanked off. You don't get Type-C by default, but you can buy a Type-C accessory. It's not very expensive. In other words, you have to make the active choice to have Type-C. Similarly, if you wish to add extra SSDs, you can buy a bracket, and the same is true if you want to add extra hard drives. My feeling is that Fractal's aiming this whole series of POP cases at system integrators who want to be able to offer absolutely everything. Small, medium, large cases, RGB, non-RGB, airflow, silent, Type-C. The permutations are certainly huge, if not limitless, and of course you get the coloured interior. Let's pull off a few panels and show you what's going on. So the main panel, 2 thumb screws, pull back, lift it away, absolutely conventional. Same deal around the back. Plain steel panel, no noise deadening material on this, however the silent does have noise deadening, and you can see the coloured interior is reflected on the rear, and we have a number of drive mounts. Unlike the more conventional drive cage with slide-in drive caddies, we have 2 drive mounts that attach respectively to the floor of the case and to the underside of the power supply housing. Or I can take the mount, put it up there. That opens up the floor of the case. Behind this magnetically retained cover, we have a little storage container. I must confess, I don't personally feel the need to be able to put my USB flash drives or SD cards or other bits and pieces in my PC case. My feeling is that Fractal thought there's space, we can do this thing, it won't cost as much, why not? Let's pull off the front panel. So one piece, there's no separate filter. You're relying on the mesh to catch the dust. You'll have to vacuum clean that every so often. And if we remove this interior bracket, and you can, if you choose, install 1 or 2 optical drives in the floor of the case. Now, whether that makes much sense to you if your PC is on the floor, that's a good question. If it's up on your desk, I can see it might make sense. I personally feel no need to use a CD/DVD writer whatsoever. I have an external USB drive. I might burn a few discs once a year as a favour for somebody else. I just don't use them myself. However, I know that some of the Kit Guru audience do like to use optical discs. I'd love to know why you want them. Please comment below. Had a conversation with James about this. We're both completely in the dark, but this case does support 2 optical drives, and indeed the Mini and the XL. It's across the entire POP range. Of course, the permutations of optical drives, hard drives and SSDs depends entirely on what you want to install and where. But if you're populating down here with optical drives, that's going to change the permutations available to you. Cooling support. The POP is supplied with 3 aspect 12 fans, 120mm fans. This is the RGB version of the case, so the fans are RGB. The fans themselves 1200 RPM rated, and they are voltage controlled, not PWM. That doesn't best please me. I like PWM. Around the back of the case, when you look at the cabling, there's no form of hub for either fan control or RGB control. The fans are ARGB 5 volt rather than old school 12 volt, and you can daisy chain them together, both in terms of the RGB and also the fan speed control. You need one ARGB header on the motherboard to control all the fans, and you can get away with one fan header on your motherboard to control the 3 case fans. If your motherboard lacks an ARGB header, you can connect the daisy chained fans to this header inside the top of the case, and then control the lighting function from this hardware button on the top I/O panel. Fan support. The case has 2 120-140s in the front, 2 120-140s in the roof, and a 120 in the rear. So that's 4 140s or 5 120s. However, if you're buying a budget case, common sense is you're going to hang on to the stock fans unless they're a total disaster, in which case realistically the question is, do you add a 240 or a 280 cooler for your CPU? If you're going air cooled on the CPU, you have the option of leaving the roof unpopulated or adding fans there. For the fun of it, I've installed 2 EK Quantum Surface 240mm radiators, one in the front and one in the roof. You could, I think, build a custom loop using one or both radiators. However, there isn't really a straightforward way of putting a pump reservoir unit in there. A bracket on the front radiator is about the only thing that makes any sense, and then you're going to be restricting your options for graphics cards. This case, to my mind, is intended in terms of liquid cooling for AIO rather than custom loop. But we know there are CPU blocks with integrated pumps. I have a Barrow unit somewhere behind me. EK has recently been talking about just such a unit, so you don't need a separate pump reservoir. It could be done. My advice would be don't go there. Air cooling or AIO are the 2 options that you should entertain. Here's the hardware I've lined up to go inside the POP AIR RGB. I've taken a look at the user guide. There are 2 suggested approaches to building your PC inside the POP, according to the user guide. Air tower, dead straightforward, build your PC, air cooler on the processor. For the AIO approach, we have the cooler in the front of the case, hoses down, with the stock fans on the outside and the AIO's fans on the inside, so the fans in push-pull. They don't show a configuration for the AIO to go in the roof. I'm absolutely fine with that approach, but it means that this business of extended radiator brackets, mounting the rad in the roof and offsetting it from the memory, isn't even included in the user guide. My chosen motherboard, MSI Meg Z690 Unify, a very expensive high-end Z690, but it's ATX rather than E-ATX, so it'll be a snug fit, but it'll be fine. We have a Sapphire RX 6800 XT graphics card. Occasionally we get comments below my videos saying it looks like a reference design. It is. It's the reason I bought it, because it is a reference design. Gives useful information. Cooler. I'm going to go for this Fractal Celsius Plus S24 Prisma. Power supply, I'm using Fractal's own Ion Plus 2 860 watt. And then we have some Kingston Fury DDR5 memory, Sabrent Rocket SSD, and a Core i9 12900K processor. All the doings that I require. Frankly, over the top for this chassis, that's my feeling, but a stern test. That's the PC built. In the main compartment, it looks tidy enough. Around the back, No complaints there. Next up, it's on with the panels. Turn it on, see what the RGB looks like, and then check out the cooling. Back panel goes on nice and easy. I thought there might be problems with clearance for the cables. Thankfully, it looks like I was wrong. To my mind, an aspect of the design of the Fractal POP Air is the power supply shroud, which is full length and solid and is riveted at the front. You cannot install a 360 cooler in the front of the chassis. On the other hand, I'm quite convinced the power supply shroud makes the chassis considerably more rigid than it might otherwise be. The steel they've used is quite flexy, removing the fans from the front of the case, for example, so I could then install them in push-pull on the AIO. The steel, very thin. However, the built PC is sufficiently rigid. The side panels go on nice and easy. There's no problem whatsoever. So I think they've designed the chassis down to a price, and then they've helped it out by, for example, installing this power supply shroud which braces the entire structure. To test the Fractal Design POP Air, I installed, as you saw, a Core i9-12900K and this RX 6800 XT graphics card. The motherboard MSI Meg Z690 Unify. When I did the launch review of this processor, I used that same motherboard, and I noted at the time it was feeding an awful lot of power to the processor, and as a result it was running rather hot. When I ran this system initially, it feeds about 240 watts to the CPU, high voltage, that's 4.9 gigahertz on the P cores, so the speed is correct, the power is unnecessarily high, and the processor whacked straight up to 100 Celsius. So I locked the power down to 190 watts, which means the system as a whole is drawing about 520 watts at the wall socket. The CPU is running at 4.7 gigahertz. I could have fiddled with the core voltage, but limiting the power to still quite a high figure was the most straightforward and direct way of keeping the system under control. I used 3 configurations of fans, starting with the AIO fans and the case fans running at 1000 RPM, which sounded like this. And then I increased the fan speed to 1200 RPM, so the case fans are now running at 100% and the AIO fans at about 2/3 speed. Sounded like this. And finally I increased all the fans to full speed, which means the case fans still at 1200, the AIO fans now at 1800, and it sounded like this. So yes, with all the fans running fast, the case does get somewhat noisy. Turn the fans down to 1200 or even 1000 and it's actually impressively quiet, despite the fact there's no noise deadening material used anywhere. It just works fairly well. Noise levels perfectly acceptable. Cooling. This is with an ambient of 23 degrees. With the fans running at 1000 RPM, CPU running at 4.7 drawing 190 watts and the GPU drawing 175 watts, we saw a CPU temperature of 92 and a GPU temperature of 73. Increasing the fan speed to 1200 RPM, the CPU dropped 2 degrees to 90 and the GPU dropped 1 degree to 72. Turning the AIO fans up to maximum, we see a further drop in the CPU temperature to 87 and the GPU drops a further degree to 71. So the temperatures are perfectly okay, nothing particularly special, and in a case of this size, pretty much what you'd expect. In conclusion, what do I think of the Fractal Design POP Air RGB? Pros, the good points. The price is quite low. Second, it supports 2 optical drives. I'm not saying that's a big selling point to me, but I know full well some of the Kit Guru audience wants optical drive support. This case has it, and in this day and age, for some people, that will be very welcome. Nifty styling, including coloured interior options. I happen to think that this cyan looks a bit peculiar with this RGB marquee rotating, Pretty much the only colour it looks good with, in my opinion, is white. And when you consider that the graphics card has red lighting, it actually becomes a bit peculiar. Nonetheless, I'm never going to knock a manufacturer for giving options. I just think you need to consider your choice quite carefully. The case is supplied with 3 ARGB fans. The RGB is fairly basic, it's in the hub rather than the periphery, but it looks fine. You can see it through the mesh quite nicely, and you get a large number of storage options. The permutations for storage in this case are just amazing to my mind. Cons, the negative points. The Aspect 12 fans are voltage controlled rather than PWM. Clearly it's a cost thing. I like PWM far more than voltage controlled. The cooling options do not include 360mm cooler support, which is a bit of a shame in this day and age. However, it's a fact. This case is clearly suited to a mainstream PC rather than a high-end PC. The steel chassis is thin and flexible, as I've already mentioned. Having said that, Fractal's worked around that. It's clearly a factor in the costing of this case, and it means that it is definitely towards the budget end rather than the premium end. USB Type-C on the front I/O panel is an extra expense. Again, clearly it's a cost-saving thing. At least Fractal Design has offered this as an option. It's not particularly expensive, so you can add Type-C to this case, but you don't get it by default. Overall, you can see those negative points are relatively minor. I'm going to give the Fractal Design POP Air an 8.5 out of 10 and a worth buying award.